An hour after the car started, it was time for the quads to leave the starting blocks. There was a big field of quads in the lineup, and KwaZulu-Natal rider Paul Chomsa started from the front, with 200 rider Costello next. Wildman Jacques Struwig was on one of the few four-stroke quads in the field, while Van Deventer had to make up 10 places in order to get to the front. This is perhaps the most physically demanding race on the calendar for quad riders. Unlike a motorcycle, a quad doesn't fit into the wheel tracks made by cars, and the riders are constantly fighting for control. 1,000 grueling kilometers lie ahead as Chomsa pulls away from the crowds at the start. Unlike the first car though, he at least had the advantage of having wheel tracks to follow. Costello on the single-cylinder 200 would soon be caught by the bigger engine Class L quads of Jacques Struwig and Paul Breckel, who started behind him.
The quad fields have grown tremendously. At the last race in Sugarbelt we had 40 entries. In this race we've got another 40. We're expecting big things now, and it's a good place for guys to start. It's not expensive and you can get up and start racing for a very little amount of money.
Polaris rider Niels van der Walt is fifth in the championship, 1 point ahead of Chomsa. It was an important race for both riders.
If we get past the rocks, the sand, being a man from Natal, I think the sand will be my advantage, yeah. And I don't think the guys will catch me in the sand.
The first real test of this race is the dreaded riverbed. Thanks to El Nino, it was dry, 30-odd kilometers of power and energy-sapping, choking sand. The only way through is to stand far back, keep the throttles wide open, and let the bike dance around underneath. It's certainly not for the faint-hearted. Another problem is that the ruts left by cars tend to pull the quad, but often a rider becomes a passenger. Struwig looks around and finds himself being pulled into a rut. That hole caught Christo van der Bava by surprise, and the championship leader was lucky to emerge unscathed.
This riverbed is very difficult to do, especially when it's dry. And the reason being is that the local population have to get water, and they dig deep holes to get to the water. And it's very uneasy to see them. As you can see, Bodo and Gary got stuck here. But also have a look at their tyres. They've got the wrong choice of tyres for this type of event. You want something that's going to get on top of the sand and doesn't dig it in. And as they're pulling in, you can see they're not making too much progress in this part of the race. The track is hard on the outsides, and guys tend to go towards the outside, towards the banks to get more traction, but this is where you get stuck, and once your car's floating it's best to stick to the existing track and stay on top of the sand.
It wasn't long before the more agile quads were catching up to and passing their bulkier cousins. The Polaris, ridden by Van der Walt, features a constantly variable transmission and proved particularly effective in the sand. The 200 class riders had their work cut out in the sand as the little single-cylinder engines worked very hard indeed. By now, De Villiers had managed to pass Costello, but it was still close, and they hadn't yet completed 1/10 of the race distance.
The 200 cc's are disadvantaged in this race because they don't have the same power as a 250. And as you can see, these guys don't seem to stay in the track. They're bouncing all over. You've got to move your body weight to drive the bike. It's very important. Otherwise, you're going to end up high-siding and landing with the bike landing on top of you.
This is Jan Lotter, on and off the throttle, as he makes it all look so easy. Francois Coetzee rides for the Jojo Tanks team alongside Struwig, and he's also aboard one of the lethargic-sounding four-stroke Honda models. Another Honda rider is Fani de Jong, but unlike Struwig and Coetzee, he's aboard the 330cc two-stroke version that Vickers van Deventer used briefly a few seasons ago. On one of the popular Yamaha Banshee models, Jan Smit was looking forward to a finisher's medal. Last to begin racing were the bikes, and it was the dedicated rising star Clayton Enslin who drew first and would start ahead of 200 class rider Wayne Farmer, as Spencer Creel started third ahead of the maestro Alfie Cox. With little separating the performance of the top 20 starters, it was going to be an interesting race before racing order resembled the usual pattern. Who was going to stick their necks out and seize the opportunity, and who was going to adopt the cautious approach? By the time the two-wheel brigade started, it was a lot warmer, and the cars had been racing for 2 hours. Still, a large crowd remained to watch the bikes begin their adventure. Clerk of the course, Peter Monsieur Wilson, counts them down, and then turns his back on the departing rider to avoid being showered with sand. Young charger and early race leader Clayton Enslin had his race strategy all worked out.
So there's some fast guys coming from the back, and I think if I can just maintain a constant pace, we'll get to the sand, and then I can make another strategy from there.
By the time the bikes entered the riverbed section, the front runners had already caught up to the tail end of the quad field, and the different techniques required made for interesting comparison. The two-wheelers' approach seemed far more brutal and ferocious compared to either the quads or the cars. Last year's winner, Graham McLaughlin, stepped up to the open class for this year's race and looked absolutely committed as he ducked and weaved between the trees. Similarly, teammates Jeremy Davies was showing all the style that took him to championships almost a decade ago. A few years ago, he broke a leg badly and moved to circuit car racing, but the lure of off-road racing proved too much. Passing cars is a tricky maneuver aboard a bike. Darrell Curtis shows his fearless style despite a punctured rear tyre. Quinton Milton hails from Port Shepstone and is regarded as something of an enduro specialist. He looked very smooth, as opposed to Rian van Niekerk, who was really hanging on the cables. Unlike the cars and the quads, the bike boys were racing as though there was no tomorrow, and were treating this 1,000-kilometre desert classic as though it was a sprint race. KTM's Jeffrey Wallater is one of the most consistent riders on the scene and was being chased hard by fellow AGA Panasonic Castrol KTM team rider Carl Leroux, who was on one of the bigger 360cc versions. After a series of bone-breaking crashes over the past 2 years, Errol Dalton seems to have at last regained the form that took him to victory here in 1995. Panasonic Russell Campbell Racing's Greg Aspinall hasn't been racing in the Off-Road Championship for long, but the former motocrosser has quickly established himself as one of the front runners. With the tracks between trees being very narrow, passing any other competitor was never going to be easy. Shell Honda rider Grant Broomfield picks his spot before passing 200 class quad leader John Craig Costello. Once clear, he quickly pulls away and makes it all look very smooth. Watch Peter Milan fighting his Kawasaki KDX 200 through the soft sand, and you can see the effort required. To win here, one has to be very fit and have bags of stamina. Reinecker and Houghton were in complete control of the production category and fighting it out with the Chepex Raceco Porsche for the overall lead.